Good morning, everyone. I hope all of you are doing well and are healthy. I'd like to first start by thanking the numerous doctors, nurses, and first responders all over the world who are working so hard to keep us safe during these difficult times. Now, the world has changed dramatically in the 3 months since our last update of the World Economic Outlook in January. A rare disaster, a coronavirus pandemic, has resulted in a tragically large number of human lives being lost. Now, as countries implement needed containment measures to control the pandemic, the world has been put in a great lockdown. The magnitude and speed of collapse in activity that has followed is unlike anything experienced in our lifetimes. This is a crisis like no other, which means there is substantial uncertainty about the impact it will have on people's lives and livelihoods. A lot will depend on the epidemiology of the virus, the effectiveness of containment measures, and the development of therapeutics and vaccines, variables which are very hard to predict. In addition, many countries face multiple crises: a health crisis, a financial crisis, a collapse in commodity prices, especially for commodity exporters, and all of this interact in complex ways. Now, policymakers are responding in an unprecedented manner by helping households, firms, and financial markets. However, there is still considerable uncertainty about what the economic landscape will look like when we emerge from this lockdown. So now, under the assumption that the pandemic and required containment peaks in the second quarter in most countries in the world, and then recedes in the second half of this year, we are projecting global growth in 2020 to fall to minus 3%. Now, this is a downgrade of 6.3 percentage points from January 2020, a major revision over a very short period of time. This makes the Great Lockdown the worst recession since the Great Depression and far worse than the global financial crises. Assuming the pandemic fades in the second half of 2020 and that policy actions taken around the world are effective in preventing widespread firm bankruptcies, extended job losses, and system-wide financial strains, we project global growth in 2021 to rebound to 5.8%. Now, this recovery in 2021 is only partial, as the level of economic activity is projected to remain below the level we had projected for 2021 before the virus hit. The cumulative loss to global GDP over 2020 and 2021 from the pandemic crisis could be around $9 trillion, greater than the economies of Japan and Germany combined. Now, this is a truly global crisis, as no country is spared. Countries reliant on tourism, travel, and entertainment for their growth are experiencing major disruptions. Emerging market and developing economies face additional challenges. They face unprecedented reversals in capital flows, major currency pressures, while at the same time coping with weaker health systems and much lower fiscal space to support their economies. So for the first time since the Great Depression, both advanced economies and emerging and developing economies are in recession. For 2020, growth in advanced economies is projected at minus 6%. Emerging market and developing economies, which typically have normal growth levels well above advanced economies, are also projected to have negative growth of minus 1% and minus 2.2% if you exclude China. Now, income per capita is projected to shrink for over 170 countries. Now, we're projecting recoveries for both advanced economies and emerging and developing economies in 2021, but that, again, is partial. Now, what I have described is a baseline scenario. But given the extreme uncertainty around the duration and intensity of the health crises, we also explore alternative, more adverse scenarios. The pandemic may not recede in the second half of this year, leading to longer containment periods, worsening financial conditions, and further breakdowns in global supply chains. In such cases, global GDP will fall even further by an additional 3% in 2020. And if the health crisis rolls over into 2021, it can reduce the level of global GDP by an additional 8% compared to the baseline. Now, moving on to what are the important policy actions the countries need to take. Firstly, on the health front, flattening the spread of COVID-19 using lockdowns allows health systems to cope with this crisis, which then permits a resumption of economic activity. In this sense, there is no trade-off between saving lives and saving livelihoods. Countries should continue to generously support their health systems, perform widespread testing, and refrain from trade restrictions on medical supplies. A global effort must ensure that when therapies and vaccines are developed, both rich and poor nations alike have immediate access. Now, while the economy isn't shut down, policymakers will need to ensure that people are able to meet their basic needs and that businesses can pick up once the acute phases of the pandemic pass. The large, timely, and targeted fiscal, monetary, and financial policies already taken by many policymakers have been lifelines to households and businesses. This support should continue throughout the containment phase to minimize persistent scars that could emerge from subdued investment and job losses during this deep recession. Policymakers must also plan for the recovery. As containment measures come off, policies should shift swiftly to supporting demand, incentivizing firm hiring, and repairing balance sheets on private and public sectors to aid the recovery. Now, fiscal stimulus that is coordinated across countries that have fiscal space will magnify the benefits for all economies. Now, moratoria on debt payments and debt restructuring may need to be continued during the recovery phase. Now, multilateral cooperation is vital to the health of the global recovery. To support needed spending in developing countries, bilateral creditors and international financial institutions should provide concessional financing, grants, and debt relief. Collaborative effort is needed to ensure that the world does not deglobalize, so that the recovery is not damaged by further losses to productivity. At the International Monetary Fund, we are doing our part. We are actively deploying our $1 trillion lending capacity to support vulnerable countries, including through rapid dispersing emergency financing and debt service relief to our poorest member countries. And we are calling on official creditors to do the same. Now, there are some hopeful signs that this health crisis will end. Countries are succeeding in containing the virus using social distancing practices, testing, and contact tracing, at least for now. And treatments and vaccines may develop sooner than we expect. But in the meantime, we face tremendous uncertainty around what comes next. Commensurate with the scale and speed of the crises, domestic and international policy responses need to be large, rapidly deployed, and speedily recalibrated as new data becomes available. The courageous actions of doctors and nurses around the world need to be matched by policymakers so we can jointly overcome the crises. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geeta. Thank you, everyone, for joining us again. So we do have a number of questions that have already come in. Maybe I'll start with a few questions here, and then again I encourage you to keep on sending those questions. So the first question I have is from Phil Aldrich from the Times of London. The question he has is, this is the deepest recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s, but how deep was that, to clarify the comparison? And countries will be left with dangerously high levels of debt. Will we need to see a period of high taxes once the crisis is past to bring debt back to sustainable levels?
So during the Great Depression, so if you look at the period between 1929 and 1932, for advanced economies, the contraction was around 16%. And in this recession that we're seeing right now, the contraction for advanced economies projected is around 6%. So clearly, the magnitude of the collapse was much worse during the Great Depression. Now, in terms of world or global output, of course, data was more scattered at that time during the Great Depression, but the numbers that are out there are about a contraction of about 10% globally. And right now, we have a contraction projected for about 3%. Now, this crisis requires timely action by governments, and that involves spending on the health sector, on firms, on households, and that can be quite substantial. So we are projecting debt levels to go up quite significantly over this next 12 months. The question is, what happens next? Now, because we have a recovery that we're projecting for 2021, our debt to GDP levels will stabilize going forward. And the question is, how do you bring that down, or how do you finance that? As long as interest rates remain very low, as we're seeing, and we get the recovery that we're projecting, then the combination should help in bringing down debt levels slowly over time. Now, there will be some countries in the world that would require help, external aid, debt restructurings, but we'll have to see what that looks like once we come out of this pandemic.
Thank you. I have a question here from Eric Martin at Bloomberg, and the question is on the report. The World Economic Outlook only considers downside alternative scenarios, not upsides. Is that a sign of the times that we're living in, that things are expected to be bad and can only get worse from here? Question.
I think the best description of the sign of our times is the tremendous uncertainty about the outlook going forward. Downside risks prevail right now if you look at the developments around the world. Now, of course, that said, there could be positive news. There could be new therapeutics develop very quickly, and things could turn much better. But right now, as we see it, downside risks prevail. And so we have explored the scenario where the pandemic, instead of receding in the second half of this year, which is what is assumed in the baseline, continues. And even worse, that there are outbreaks in 2021. If that happens, you can get a further substantial hit to global growth.
Thank you, Geeta. So moving on to Delphine Toitou at AFP. She asks, what are the fund recommendations for governments to ensure a solid recovery when the pandemic is over, especially for advanced economies?
The strength of the recovery, firstly, is going to depend a lot on what governments do now during this period of containment. So it's very important that during this period of containment, governments provide the necessary support, economic support that's required for households so that they can meet their expenses, for firms, businesses, to prevent them from going bankrupt and becoming, exiting the market. So those measures are very essential alongside, of course, important health measures to actually contain the virus. Once the recovery happens and we are past the pandemic phase, for advanced economies, it would be essential to undertake a broad-based fiscal stimulus. And this would be even more effective if it were coordinated across all the advanced economies of the world. So that would be one important step. Monetary policy should, of course, be data-driven. And if inflation stays well below targets, interest rates should also stay low for that period of time. And given that we've lived through this crisis, it's very important to prepare and to prevent something like this from happening again. So this would require building health systems around the world even more, sharing more knowledge, and being better prepared the next time around.
Thank you, Geeta. So I'm going to move now to some region-specific questions. The first ones are on Asia. So this is a question from Zhang Xi. So the question is, though China is gradually resuming normal economic activity, China will still be influenced by the supply and demand disruptions of the rest of the world due to the containment measures. How is the fund evaluating this as an impact on China's economy? Given this factor, will China's recovery be more of a U-shape or a V-shape?
So China was worst hit in the first quarter when it was the epicenter of the pandemic. In the second quarter, measures have started to come off. Containment measures started coming off towards the end of the first quarter. And so we are seeing signs of recovery. But again, we have to keep in mind that the rest of the global economy is now in the grips of the pandemic, and there are severe containment measures around the world. So that would have a big negative impact on, in terms of external demand on China's growth. I'd like to bring in Malhar over here if he would like to add something on to this question. Malhar?
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I think the Chinese, as you pointed out, Geeta, the first quarter contraction in activity is expected to be quite severe. But it's important to recognize that there are signs of normalization now. The economy is getting back to operating. It's a very gradual normalization. The economy has policy space to support the recovery. With the spread of the pandemic to other regions, especially the important trading partners, there are going to be strong global headwinds to the recovery for China. But overall, with the momentum the economy had going into this crisis and the policy space that the economy has, we think it's poised to register a positive growth this year, albeit modest positive growth relative to the strong growth rates that we've been accustomed to seeing from the Chinese economy in the past.
Thank you, Geeta and Malhar. So I have another question now on Asia. This is from Republica Daily in Nepal. How do you see the economic fallout of COVID-19 in the low-income or poor countries like Nepal? What recommendations do you have for them to revive their economy after the health crisis subsides?
So for countries that are low-income countries, the challenges of this crisis are just manifold. On the one hand, they have to deal with a health crisis, with health systems that are not as strong as in the advanced world. They have lesser fiscal space to do the kinds of spending that is required. Now, for a country like Nepal, where tourism is an important source of revenue, this is a big hit because one of the sectors that has been most hit during this crisis is travel, tourism, hospitality, entertainment. What should countries like this do? I think at this point in time, it is important to do whatever it takes on the health front to make sure that the necessary spending is done. It's also very important to support your workers. Now, many are there in the informal sector. That would require using mechanisms like cash transfers, using digital payment systems in countries that have those, to reach the daily workers who work on daily wages. And at the same time, support small and medium-scale enterprises so that once this pandemic ends and there is a resumption of global activity in all parts of the world, that these countries can also improve. I also would like to mention that for low-income countries that have high levels of debt burden, it is very important for creditors around the world, official creditors around the world, to step up and provide debt relief to these countries.
All right. So I'm going to switch regions and go to a number of questions we have received on Europe. So the first question comes from L'Opinion in France. And the question is, I would like to know why the 2020 recession you're forecasting for the euro area is worse for that region than other regions.
There are a number of variables involved there. So one, of course, is if you, for instance, compare the euro area numbers to what we have for the US. Now, the euro area started with lower projected growth, even in 2019, compared to the US. And so that's why the numbers look much lower now, though the revisions are approximately in the same ballpark. In addition, you see, compared to many other parts of the world, the euro area, Europe has been hit very hard by this crisis, and that is also another factor that plays an important role. I'd like to bring in Gian Maria here to see if you would like to add something.
No, I think you've touched on the main thing. It's really the severity of the epidemic, and in a sense, we are in a position where we are seeing now the pandemic slowing in Europe, but we are a bit ahead of where, unfortunately, other countries may be heading. So we've really seen the worst hit to global activity, and that is fully reflected in our current forecast. That's the main reason for the relative pessimism compared to other regions in the world. So Europe is a very open. European countries are very open to international trade. Many of them have actually, despite their size, quite a heavy reliance on tourism. Those are all sectors that are hit very heavily by the crisis.
Thanks very much, Gita and Gian Maria. So I have another question on Europe, again from our colleagues at Agence France Presse. The question is, given the huge increase in debt and deficits, how concerned are you about the future growth potential, especially for Italy, Spain, and France?
You know, this crisis, we have to first start by reminding ourselves that this crisis is a truly exogenous shock, and it calls for countries to step up and do the needed spending that's required in the health sector, for firms, for people. So the deficits are called for. What would this look like going forward? A lot, again, depends on the interest rates at which countries are borrowing and the interest rates at which they would have to roll over. Now, in the euro area, the substantial support being provided by the ECB on this front is helping keep borrowing costs low for many countries, including Italy and Spain. And as long as that is the case, going forward, once there is a recovery, we should see these debt levels coming down. Now, of course, there is a tremendous uncertainty about this crisis. There could be much worse outcomes. There could be much greater vulnerabilities across the board, including in the banking sector, and one has to keep a close eye on that.
Thank you, Gita. So another question on Europe, and this one is on the UK. So how does the UK's economic response compare to other nations, and would you encourage the UK Treasury to do more to support businesses and the economy? This is from Michael Blair at Sky News.
UK has taken a very aggressive approach. They've come in with large, substantial, very carefully targeted measures. So they have done all the right things at this point. Considerable support to firms and to households and to the financial system. I'd like to bring in Gian Maria if you would like to add something.
No, absolutely. Has been a very powerful response both from the Treasury and from the Bank of England. This is absolutely essential to allow the economy to restart. I would like also to refer back to something that Gita said earlier in her opening remarks. We need governments have responded very aggressively, as they should have. They also need to be very nimble and able to adjust their response to the changing environment. As you know, we're learning new things about how the epidemic spreads, about how long the epidemic will be with us, and policies need to be adjusted accordingly.
Thank you, Gita, Gianmaria. So I'm going to switch again here, and this is a question on the OPEC agreement and its impact on oil-producing countries. The question is, how does the OPEC agreement change your view on the MENA region and the Russian outlook?
The oil price collapse that we've seen recently is a combination of a sharp drop in demand coming out of this coronavirus crisis, and also the breakdown of OPEC plus negotiations. Of course, it's in the benefit of the world that we have much less volatility in oil prices, that these markets stay more stable. We are assuming in our projections that the price of oil would be around $35 for 2020 and around that level for 2021, and then go back up to $45. So that is still well below the prices that we saw pre-virus, and that has an important impact on countries that are oil producers. For that, I'll bring in again Gianmaria, if you would like to comment on Russia and MENA.
Yes. Well, obviously the main factor that has been driving oil prices down has been the collapse in demand for oil, as transportation, car transportation and especially air travel have come down very, very sharply. And the world was running fast out of storage space, really, to store oil that was being produced but not consumed. Obviously, so the reduction, the promised reduction in supply is going to help stabilize the market, but the forecasts that we currently have are based on a path of oil prices which is quite similar to what you see embedded currently in futures prices. For oil exporters, obviously weakness in oil prices implies lower fiscal revenues, hence lower either lower spending by the government, lower support for the non-oil sectors, lower revenues flowing to that sector, and hence a lower growth. On the other side, of course, the redistribution favors oil importers, but the risk is that vulnerable oil exporters will be forced to very drastic reductions in aggregate spending and demand, and that could weigh on global economic activity.
Thanks, Gianmaria. So I'm going to change region again, and thank you all again for sending your questions. Moving on now to this hemisphere, the Americas. I have first a couple of questions on the U.S. So first from Barry Wood, and then from David Lynch at the Washington Post. First question is, for the U.S., what sort of a recovery are you expecting next year? Could this be a V or a U-shape recovery, or even a check mark? And do you expect it to reach pre-crisis levels by the end of the year or in early 2021? And then the second question on the U.S. from David Lynch. What are the implications for post-crisis growth rates of the enormous increase in debt being taken on in the U.S. and other advanced economies?
On the U.S., our projection in terms of the baseline is for growth to contract by 5.9% in 2020 and then grow by 4.7% in 2021. Now, if you add those together, what that tells you is that we are projecting in terms of levels for economic activity to be still below the pre-virus trend even in 2021. We think it's highly unlikely that you will be back to trend by the end of 2020. Now, of course, if there was more positive news that comes about very quickly, we could see big changes, and in 2021, things could be better than what we have. But this is a deep recession. It is a recession that involves solvency issues. It is a deep recession that involves unemployment rates going up dramatically. And these tend to leave scars. And while there are many very strong policy actions being taken, some of this will spill over into the second half of this year and into 2021. On the question of debt, there has been sizable fiscal expansion as is required at this time. But again, the U.S. is able to borrow at very, very low rates. We have had this experience before when during the global financial crisis, there was a big increase in debt in the U.S., but that came down quickly in terms of a ratio of GDP once the crisis started abating. Something similar could happen this time around. There could be an increase with the kind of growth projections we have and the kinds of interest rates we are foreseeing going forward. We could see an improvement in the debt trajectory once the recovery starts.
Thank you, Geeta. Staying in the region, this is a question from Luis Fernando Silva Pinto from TV Globo in Brazil. The question is, the IMF projects that Brazil will grow 2.9% in 2021. This growth is below that of other countries in the region, such as Chile and Peru. Why does the IMF consider that Brazil will grow less than other Latin American countries? And the second question is, does the IMF advise that Brazil continue with its economic reforms regardless of the economic impact produced by COVID-19?
Brazil has been hit by multiple shocks. So it's been hit by the collapse in commodity prices. It's been hit by slowing global growth, especially in its trading partners, including in China recently. And of course, the epidemic in Brazil itself is leading to serious domestic disruptions. So all of these factors combine together to produce the estimate that we have. In terms of economic reforms in Brazil, again, those are important from a medium-term perspective. But at this point, of course, the priority, as in all countries in the world, is to deal with this pandemic crisis. And I'll see if Gian Maria would like to add anything.
Yeah, just a couple of very quick things. One is, of course, something that Geeta stressed in her opening remarks, that we stress in the WIO. We have extreme uncertainty about forecasts. We are talking about really an unprecedented crisis. Economic forecasting is already a pretty tricky business in normal times. Under these circumstances, with a lot of uncertainty coming from factors completely extraneous to pure economics, the problem is magnified. One should also take into account, in assessing how a country does, the importance of the external environment and the importance of what was happening in the country before. So we need to take into account that Chile and Peru were countries that had stronger economic performance to start with. The size of the revisions is actually relatively similar. And of course, we very much hope to be wrong. We very much hope that the recovery is going to be stronger than we currently predict, that science will come up with solutions to this crisis that will allow economic activity to restart earlier than we currently anticipate and with more strength than we currently anticipate.
Thank you. So we're coming close to the end of this broadcast. I do have still a couple of questions. One more generally on Latin America, but it can also be applied to other regions in the world. And bear with me, I'm translating this from Spanish. So to which extent does inequality and informality limit the effectiveness of government actions in Latin America? That's the question that I just received.
Factors like informality make it much harder for any country that has to deal with this crisis. So if you look at how this crisis plays out, so the main sectors get affected because of the containment measures that are in place, are, entertainment, hospitality, transportation. And several of these have very high levels of small and medium enterprises that make up these sectors. And a very large fraction of them are informal workers, especially in the developing and the emerging world. So to be able to deal with this crisis and to get assistance into the hands of the people who need it the most can be a particular challenge in these times and in countries that have large informality. So here is where you have to think out of the box. Countries have social assistance programs in place. They should broaden the scope of it. They should make it more unconditional. So use existing schemes that exist in these countries to make sure that you reach out to these people and you get money in their hands as soon as possible. And this is a crisis that unfortunately affects the poor severely, those on daily wages. And therefore, you have to think of transfers that are both in kind, in cash, broaden the scope of existing schemes, make it more unconditional. So these are the things that would help.
Thank you, Geeta. I'm taking a couple of questions here that are more general on globalization. The first one is from Maoling Xiang from Xinhua. With the shortages in medical supplies, some countries have implemented export restrictions. Do you think that COVID-19 pandemic is leading to growing protectionism? Are you concerned about the damage that it could bring? And then in the same vein, Anup Roy from the Business Standard in India asks, does the COVID-19 pandemic hold the potential to reverse globalization, at least partially? What could be the ramification of that?
So we call on all countries to refrain from putting restrictions on exports of medical supplies. It is really essential, and this is the one of the many areas where global cooperation is necessary. This is not a time to restrict the trade of medical supplies and essential equipment around the world. These are difficult times in terms of globalization for dealing with this pandemic. There's been a restriction on travel of people around the globe. There has been, because of the fact that people cannot go to work, the factories, there has been a breakdown of global supply chains. So this is a result of this crisis that we're seeing. But it is very important that this does not become a feature where we reverse all the gains that we've got from globalization. Now, the world needs a healthy recovery. It needs a strong recovery. And that will not come about if the world deglobalizes, because that will severely reduce productivity in the world. And that's the last thing we want at this time.
With that, I would like to thank our speakers today, Geeta, Jamaria, Malhar, who joined us remotely. And also thank you for joining us, and hoping you're well and you stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you.